It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Henry Foner. We're here in Jerusalem. And Henry, thank you so much for agreeing to talk about your life story and being part of the Kindertransport.
Well, thank you very much.
So if you could let us know, where were you born, and a little bit about your family?
Well, I was born, and not as Henry Foner, but as Heinz Lischwitz. I was born in Berlin in 1932. I was the son of one of three brothers Lischwitz, the only child of the whole family, in fact. And the Lischwitz family had been living in Germany for at least 200 years. In fact, I just found it the other day, they had become not German citizens, but Prussian citizens, because Germany is a very new country. People don't realize it. In 1730 something, they received Prussian citizenship in a place that was then called Hotzenplotz, which is now in the Czech Republic, was then part of Prussia. They eventually moved to Berlin, and we lived in a very large building which belonged to the family, belonged to my paternal grandmother's family in Kantstrasse in Berlin. Each of the brothers had a flat in this building, and so did my grandmother. And they were perfectly happy, thinking that they were German citizens who just happened to be Jews, until Hitler came along. Well, Hitler came into power in, I think it was January 1933, and by April, or March or April, there were already laws defining what professions Jews could have. And although the family business was a printing business, my own father was a lawyer, so he could no longer practice law. So his job was to be a legal consultant to the Jewish Community Council. That's what he did. So he was a lawyer in fact, but not in name anymore. I don't really remember very much about my life in Germany. I was a little boy. My mother died when I was 5. And I was brought up by a nanny whose name was Nopi, and my grandmother, who lived in a flat above us. My father went to work, and the relevant thing is that one day my father came to me and explained that I was going to go to live in England for a while. And he told me the name of the family I was going to, and he asked me to pray for their welfare. So every night I would kneel by my bed and I would pray for the welfare of Mr. and Mrs. X, whose name I don't remember. And I don't remember because one day shortly after that my father came and said, well, you're still going to England, but you're not going to Mr. and Mrs. X, you're going to Mr. and Mrs. Foner. And so what I would like you to do is I'd like you to switch your prayers from Mr. and Mrs. X to Mr. and Mrs. Foner, which I did.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 6. 6.5. That was in Kristallnacht was in November of 38. So I was part of this big project called the Kindertransport, Children's Transport, and I think I'd just like to speak a bit about it, if I may. Well, Kristallnacht really was the time when what was left of the German Jewish community realized that that they had to do something, that Hitler wasn't going to go away. Up till that time, many people, and I think most of my own family, had probably never imagined that somebody like Hitler could remain and rule in Germany for any length of time. It was just a short aberration. But when Kristallnacht came, they realized that this was it, and whoever could get out should. And the British government agreed to take 10,000 young children from Germany and related states into Britain for a period of 2 years, until the war was over, until the threat was over. Of course, it never became over, but they didn't know that. And the background is interesting because why did the British agree, and why 10,000? And the 10,000 was because the Jewish agency in Palestine at the time, in British mandated Palestine, when Kristallnacht came, they suggested bringing 10,000 Jews from Germany to Palestine. Well, the Arabs didn't agree, and the British Colonial Office didn't agree, and the British Foreign Office didn't agree, because everybody was more concerned about oil for the British Navy ships than they were about the lives of 10,000 Jews. And but there were people in Britain who kept pressing the government, not only Jews, but principally Quakers. And the eventual compromise made was, instead of sending 10,000 Jews to Palestine, they would temporarily admit 10,000 children under the age of 17 on a temporary basis, on condition, of course, that the costs wouldn't fall on the taxpayer. So everybody had to chip in. For every child, you had to pay £50, deposit £50, which was about, I think, £3,000 of today's money, which was quite a lot of money. People didn't have it. So the Jewish community collected money, and people gave money, and so on. But it's interesting, the background to this lies in a man called Wilfrid Israel. Wilfrid Israel was a German Jew who owned the biggest department store in Berlin. It was a huge department store called Nathan Israel. Now he was a lucky man in some ways. His mother was named Adler. She was the daughter of the chief rabbi of the British Empire. And she had this meshugas that she wanted her children to be born in England. So every time she had a child, and I can't remember how many she had, she went to England to bear it. And so Wilfrid Israel was both well-connected, very wealthy, a wonderful person, by the way, very interested in the arts, and he happened to have British citizenship. So though he was in trouble with the Nazis right from the beginning, he wasn't imprisoned or anything like that. So apart from the fact that he spent all his money in saving the Jewish members of his staff in his shop and getting them out of Germany, he had very strong contacts with the Quakers in Britain and with high society. And he was the man who was instrumental in getting the British government to allow these 10,000 Jewish children to come in to Great Britain, and I was one of them. He later on He died in a plane crash. The plane was shot. He was coming from Lisbon to London during the war, and his plane was shot down. In that plane was also a famous film actor, and there was some sort of rumor that the Nazis thought Churchill was on this plane or something. But anyway, he was shot down and died. And incidentally, he was a collector of Far Eastern art, and in Kibbutz Hazorea there's a small kibbutz, small museum called Museum Wilfrid, and that's where his collection is. There's a film about Wilfrid Israel which came out not long back, which is very well worth seeing. And the other person who really I like to talk about when I talk about the Kindertransport, because in history sometimes what individuals do matters, was a man called Nicholas Winton. Have you heard of him?
Sure.
So Nicholas Winton was a stockbroker who went to Czechoslovakia in 1938. Flies here. And saw what was happening, and single-handedly arranged to bring trainloads of children under this dispensation of 10,000 children that were allowed to come in to the United Kingdom. But what's sort of doubly marvelous about Nicholas Winton is that he did all this, and then he didn't talk about it.
So he didn't even tell his wife? His wife didn't even know?
Yeah, 50 years later, his wife went into the attic and found all these files and said, hey, what's all this stuff here? And then the story came out, and he got a knighthood, and the Czech Republic honored him, and so on, so on. But he was also a marvelous person who just went on with his life after saving DDs.
Henry, can I just mention, the Czech Republic issued a stamp of Winston, and then only after that the British government realized they should also do it. So the British government...
that was the order of things?
That was the order. The Czech first issued the stamp of him, commemorating his incredible achievements.
We had a very good friend who died a few years ago, who also was on the Kindertransport, who was one of those children, Nicholas Winton. Tommy Berman, I don't know if you knew him.
I've heard the name, yes.
Yeah. He was head of the Kinneret.
They actually had a BBC program where they had him in the audience.
And he didn't know, yes.
And all the people in the audience stood up, and they were descendants of those were the ones that he actually saved.
Right, marvelous thing.
And it was so emotional to see that.
Anyway, of course, I didn't know anything about this background. I just one day found myself on a train with many hundreds of other children.
Can I ask you, before you discuss what happened on the train, do you remember Kristallnacht?
No.
And do you remember in Germany any anti-Semitic incidents or?
No. Well, no, I don't remember any anti-Semitic incidents, although I went to school in the first grade, in a Jewish school, of course, although I didn't think I realized this at the time. What I do remember is seeing Hitler. And the story goes like this. I was going down the street with my father, hand in hand, and there were people on either side of the street standing, and there was a convoy of cars going down the middle of the street, and there was a man standing in the car, and everybody was putting their hands up and saying Heil Hitler. And why I remember it is because my father made me do the same thing, so we wouldn't stand out. So this little Jewish boy was standing there, this way I suppose, saying Heil Hitler, so we wouldn't stand out. I don't remember the face of the man in the car. I just remember there was a car and there was a man. But I do remember my father making me give this Heil Hitler salute. So that, going to the zoo, having tea with my grandmother in our house with her dog, whose name was Tommy, that I remember. I remember looking through the window of, I think it was the bathroom, and seeing zeppelins in the sky for some reason. I don't know why there were a few zeppelins in the sky. But I don't really have many memories. And I don't remember leaving my family.
Do you remember when your father mentioned that you're going to be going abroad? You're going to go to England?
I remember when telling me when I was going to
Was
go.
it very difficult to hear that you're going to be leaving the family?
No. It was just purely a routine thing. I mean, I obviously didn't realize the import of this conversation at all. And it must have been a wrench leaving my family. But and if you talk to older people older than I, from the Kindertransport, they always talk about it or make paintings. We have paintings of a friend who is a painter. But I think the shock was just so traumatic that I forgot about it.
Very possible.
Although I remember the journey very well. The train journey from Friedrichstrasse station. Because we were in one of those trains with compartments, with a corridor down one side and compartments along the carriage. And eventually the train stopped and doors flung open, and people in uniform came in and started screaming and yelling at us. It was very frightening, and doing body searches. We have one little suitcase each up on the rack above our heads. So they did a bit of body search and found nothing. But from the girls, they took all sorts of jewelry. I mean, I didn't see it myself. I just learned that. And people had, diamonds and gold coins and whatnot sewn in their clothing, which presumably they mostly found. Anyway, it was very frightening and unpleasant. And then they went out and the doors slammed again, and then the train moved forward a few hundred meters and stopped again. And then the doors opened, and that was the border between Germany and the Netherlands. The doors opened, and there were ladies in white hats and white uniforms giving out hot dogs with mustard and something to drink. And I've talked a lot of these kids from the Kindertransport, and that's what they remember. They remember those ladies in white giving out hot dogs.
These were Dutch ladies?
These were Dutch Red Cross, I think, or something, yeah.
And Henry, did you have a friend with you, or did you know anybody else on the train?
No. I mean, many years later, it transpired I had a distant cousin on that train. She was 3, so I didn't know her at all. She was a very distant cousin. We're in touch. And no, I knew nobody. And I can't remember the people there were young people who were in charge of those children. Young people whose families were held hostage in Germany, so that those young people would return. Don't know why the Germans were so worried about them returning, actually. Now I think about it, they were trying to get rid of Jews. But those were very brave young people. They were mostly members of youth movements, and they were in charge, but I don't remember any of them. I just know that from reading about it. Well, eventually we got to the Hook of Holland, and got on a ferry. The ferry crossed to Harwich in southeastern England. And we got off the boat. I still remember it because at the bottom of the gangplank was a British bobby with this helmet. And they put us, we walked across railway lines, and we got in a train. We went to London, and they put us in a big hall, which must have been in Liverpool Street Station, and we just sat there in groups waiting for people to come and collect us. So it emptied and emptied. We couldn't understand anything. Nobody spoke any English, and nobody there spoke any German, as far as I remember. Eventually a lady came. I remember her name, Selina Levy. She came from a town called Swansea, not in England, in Wales. And she collected us, and between 20, 30 kids, put us on a train, and we went to Swansea, which was about 5 hours away, west. And when we got to Swansea, we were divided up amongst our host families. And sure enough, there were Mr. and Mrs. Foner, to whom I couldn't talk.
And they knew no German?
No, but they did know Yiddish. So, you know, somehow we got on. So they took me home, and I'm told I didn't eat for a few days. Can't remember it. And then I started my new life. So after, I don't know, a few days, they took me to school. And that was it. Basically.
Did they have any children?
No, they had no children. They were childless, but they had a long, long history of looking after unfortunate children from their own families. In other words, I was not the first child in that house. So that's where I grew up, and that was in early February 1939. Now my father, I was the only child, the apple of everybody's eye, sent postcards. And the Foners, well, I'll talk about them later, but one of the sort of noble thing that they did was they never pretended to be my parents. I called them uncle and aunt, because they always said to me, Henry, you have family. We have no idea what happened to them. This was during the war, when there was no communication. We just have to wait till after the war and see. But you have a father, and you have a grandmother, and you have uncles. And they put the pictures of my father and mother next to my bed.
It's amazing.
Although they did treat me as their own child.
Were they very kind to you?
Yeah. Well, bottom line, they were marvelous. They weren't ideal parents in the 2020 fashion that you might think. Far from it. But they treated me as they would have treated their own child. And you can't ask more of people than that, for better and for worse. And they saved my life, as there's no two ways of looking at it. And their family is my family still.
You know, it's very interesting that you...
I have cousins, but they're Foner cousins.
But it's interesting that you took your surname Foner and not your original surname.
Well, that's another story. Very early on in the period between February 1939 and 3rd of September 39, it was obvious it was going to be a war. And to go around a town like Swansea with a name like Heinz-Lichtwitz, first of all, it's too German, and then secondly, so this is Mr. and Mrs. Foner, and this child, it was just too complicated. So at one time they just said to me, look, let's change your name from Heinz-Lichtwitz to Henry Foner, and that's it. And the thing is, in England, you can just do this for yourself. You don't need to. There's a way of doing it called deed poll, but officially, but you don't have to. You can call yourself Tom Brown, and if everybody calls you Tom Brown, they'll give you a passport. So I never actually changed the name officially. Although we do have a document detailing when the Lichtwitzes got their names, because Jews didn't have family names in 1730 something or other. So I became Henry Foner, and I went to school, and on my birthday, which is in June the 12th, my father telephoned me.
Was this the first time he had phoned you?
Yes, first and last. And it was a big deal when I talk about this to young people in Yad Vashem. I was trying to explain that a telephone call from abroad was a big, big deal. It wasn't like today where you pick up your phone and ring your pal in Australia and it costs you 2 cents, and 3 days in advance they'd call you up from the exchange and explain that at 3 o'clock on Wednesday you were going to get a call from abroad and you should be ready. And then somebody would pull and push little plugs into a wall. So that's in fact what happened. And I can remember it well. We had a telephone with a column here and a earpiece here, and we all stood there waiting for it to ring. And it rang, and I picked it up, or Auntie Winnie picked it up, I can't remember. And there was a man speaking, my father, in German, and I could not understand him. Because in 4 months I'd forgotten all my German.
Really?
Yeah, so I couldn't speak to my own father. So we carried on. He spoke English of some sort. I can't remember the conversation at all. But as an adult, I thought later about how he must have felt that he couldn't speak to his own child after 4 months. The thing was, I was the only child, and he sent postcards. Not only he, my grandmother and my nurse, my nanny, and all sorts of people sent postcards.
Did you write back? Did you also send back?
Yes, I wrote back. Not enough. You can tell it's not enough because of what's on the postcards. And Auntie Winnie, because I called them Uncle Morris and Auntie Winnie, kept those things, kept those postcards. And when Judy and I got married and we lived for 8 years in England, after our wedding, we came to England, the Foners gave us back all the things that were mine, because my father had also sent a lift full of furniture and all sorts of belongings. And that's one of the reasons I'm the representative of the Kindertransport in the museum of Yad Vashem, because unlike others, I had lots of artifacts, which I was happy to give them.
And today, those artifacts...
Oh, those artifacts are there, yes. They're there in... first there's a special exhibition with me as the subject, as the example of the Kindertransport, with my school bag and so on. And those postcards. And those postcards eventually got published as an album by Yad Vashem. And you can see on the postcards that until June they're written in German, and from June on they're written in English. Because then my father realized I couldn't understand German anymore. To this day, unfortunately, I can't understand German. So that's curious. Then sort of I grew up more or less as a ordinary kid in wartime Britain. Swansea was very badly bombed. It was the third most intensely bombed place after London and Coventry. So we spent a lot of time in the bomb shelters.
Henry, can I just ask, when you went to school for the first day, not knowing English, or was it very difficult to to make friends, to understand what was going on?
Well, I obviously didn't understand what was going on, but what I got to say is that people were very, very kind to me.
They were good. And your classmates, they were accepting?
Yes. It's a funny thing. I can explain it perhaps to you, but I can't explain it to young Israelis, which is perhaps success story. That was Swansea was a port town, 160,000 people, and it was much more harder to be a Catholic in Swansea than it was to be a Jew. So young Israelis can't understand what I'm talking about.
Because of the divide, Protestants and
the divide with Protestants and Catholic. Yeah.
You never experienced anti-Semitism?
No, there was anti-Semitism, yes, but nothing very serious. And if you ever look at the book that Yad Vashem put out, or the album, I think, at the end there's a whole series of postcards from my family, and then there's postcards that I got on my 7th birthday, which I told Yad Vashem, I said, well, these are have nothing to do with the Holocaust or with anything. And they said, no, it's part of the story, because these were ordinary Welsh people who knew this little boy was a refugee. So there's a card, a 7th birthday card, you know, nice, from the post office lady, whose name I can't remember, of course, and from the co-op manager of the cooperative. And the co-op manager, his son and I grew up together. He died 4 months ago. We were best friends all our lives. He was a Welsh-speaking Welshman. Actually, yesterday I got a letter from his widow. We're still friends. So people were very kind to me, with obvious exceptions, but yeah, but on the whole. So it must have been hard in school, but I don't remember anything. I mean, you know, I fought kids in school, not because I was Jewish.
Were there any other Jewish kids in your class or in your school?
There were no other Jewish kids in my school. I was the only Jew in that. In the primary school?
In the primary school?
No. In the primary school there were no other Jews. When I went to grammar school, then there were a few Jews, yes. Most of whom came on Aliyah, actually, come to think of it. Or many of whom came on Aliyah. How many were there? We used to have Jewish, instead of going to chapel, not always, but sometimes went there, we had separate Jewish assembly, let's call it. There were perhaps 6 of us, you know, and the eldest kid there, so we told jokes for a few hours or played cards or whatever it was while they were in chapel.
And Henry, can I ask the Foner family, did they keep any Jewish observance, Shabbat or the festivals? Or did they instill anything?
The Foner family?
Yeah.
The Foner family were very Jewish. Very Jewish in the sense that Israelis are not Jewish. In other words, Uncle Maurice could read in Hebrew and Aramaic and so on and so on. We had a shop, and the shop was open on Shabbat. And so we had Kiddush on Friday nights, and I had to go to Bet Knesset on Shabbat morning. After I'd done my chores, gone and bought the chicken food, and which was rationed. That was one of my chores. We had a huge garden. Uncle Maurice, he was one of 12. His father died here, came here to die. Menachem Mendel Foner came here to die, and he left money to build a house which was built called Bet Foner, which was in Bet Baiman, Esrim V'Shmoni. There's a plaque on the house. So he came here with 2 daughters to look after him to die. So they were strongly Jewish, but when he went to Bet Knesset on Yom Kippur. You went by bus. There was no way of getting there otherwise. So people would decide either you don't go to Bet Knesset or you go to Knesset by bus. And nobody thought anything of it. It was an Orthodox shul. So we went on the Chagim, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, not the others. But they were a very Jewish family, and everybody knew they were Jewish. There was no sort of trying to hide this business.
And they were accepted. They were accepted in the community.
Oh yes, yes.
And Henry, can I ask, at school,
Auntie Winnie was about the third generation of Jews born in Wales.
Can I ask, at school with your friends, did they ask how was it like being born in Germany, or did that topic ever arise?
Don't think so. Can't remember anybody ever asking. The only anti-Semitic influence I remember was when we were in secondary school, when they hanged these two British sergeants here as a reprisal, the Etzel or the Lechi, I can't remember who. Then there were things like, why didn't you go back to Palestine, sort of thing. But no, nobody asked me, nobody ever said anything as far as I remember.
It's amazing.
But it's strange. It was wartime. People's fathers were in the army and away for years, and kids in the class got killed. You'd come to school and the teacher would say, well, little Johnny is not here today because he got killed last night.
It was from the bombings.
For the bombing, and now we'll carry on doing algebra. None of this stuff about bringing in a psychologist and a psychiatrist and a social worker. It's a war. People got killed. And even as a small child, you realize this.
And Henry, when the postcards stopped coming from Berlin, from your family, did you realize that something's happening, that maybe your father's not alive anymore?
Oh yes, even if I was 6, because the last postcard, if you look at it, the last postcard is dated 31st of March. I think it was 31st of August, 31st of August, 39. And it's written in English, and it said something like, if war is coming, then God bless you and uncle and aunt, your loving daddy, something like that. And of course the next day war came to Europe. It was a few days later that Britain declared war. And that was the last thing I heard from my father, except for one letter. We have a Red Cross letter, which, have you ever seen one? Yeah, so it's 25 words that one side can write, and 25 words that the other person can send back. So there's my 25 words. It's all very meaningless, I'm well, hope you're well, and so on. But that was the last, that was in 1942. My father was deported at the end of 42. So that was the last correspondence or contact I had with my family till after the war.
And do you know where your father was deported to? Do you know any details what happened?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story. There were 3 brothers, Lischwitz. Walter, the youngest. Walter and Ludwig, they were in the printing business. My father was a lawyer, the only one who wasn't. Walter read Mein Kampf in 1933, decided that this man Hitler meant every word he said, and ran away, fled to France. Didn't flee far enough. When the Germans came to invaded France, he and his wife fled to Vichy in the south of France. Eventually they were picked up and put in concentration camps. and suffered, but they weren't sent to Auschwitz or anything. The war finished before they could do that. But it did ruin their lives in many ways. The second uncle, Ludwig, was married to a German woman, non-Jewish, who came from a family of fanatic Nazis, and they pressed her to divorce him, as was very common in those days. She refused, and she stood by him through the war. He was in the underground. There was a German underground, not a Jewish underground. It was a German underground. He was quite famous. He eventually had to go literally underground in the sewers, and she fed him by dropping bread through the grates in the street. But he became famous. There's books where he's mentioned. He rented a shop from the Afghan embassy. Why the hell the Afghans had an embassy in Berlin in 1939? Can you imagine it? He set it up as an electrical wholesaler's shop with all sorts of wires outside. Inside he had a printing press, and he printed documents for the underground, for the German underground. We know all this because there's books written by the people he saved or worked with. There's one book by a man called I've forgotten his name, just a second. He was a famous composer, but nobody I know has ever heard of him. And somebody wrote a biography of him and got in touch, but he was his cellmate when he was captured. He was captured and imprisoned under a false name and put in a holding cell. And while he was there, he worked on the electrics, and there was an air raid. And my uncle Lulu cut the electricity of the barbed wire fence whilst the Germans were in the shelter. And he and his cellmate nipped over the wire into the Jewish cemetery and escaped. And in the book there's the papers, the forged papers that my uncle made for him. And there's also a book called The Forger by a man called Sioma Schönhaus, who was my uncle's partner in this forging event. And Sioma Schönhaus is just interesting. He escaped on a bicycle to Switzerland with 100 Reichsmarks, which my uncle gave him. But he was an artist. It's a long story. The book's in English, translated, still in print, called The Forger. He made the rubber stamps. He painted the rubber stamps, which authenticated the documents which my uncle printed. And they were excellent, except that you could never show anybody these documents in the rain, because they were watercolors. And the ink would run, you see. So anyway, my uncle got away. He survived the war, and he set up the family business again until the communists took it over. He had to do it. He ran away and had to do it all over again. And my father, as I told you before, he worked for the Jewish Community Council.
Yeah.
Well, excuse me, I don't know what. At some point, the Germans what they did was they shipped out as many German Jews as they could. Then the rest of them they concentrated in Berlin, and then they emptied out Berlin. And my grandmother, for instance, was in the last big shipment. It was called the last big shipment from Berlin in the early 1943, and she was shipped off to Theresienstadt. And Theresienstadt was the sort of holiday camp of the concentration camps. Just to show what a holiday camp is, there were 1,200 and something Jews shipped, and it was late, it was in 43, of whom 200 came back. So that was considered an easy camp. And she came back.
She came back?
She came back, yeah. And I saw her after the war. And but at some point the Germans decided to use the members of the Jewish Community Council to accompany them when they rounded up Jews. And my father was with them, and they told those Jews that if they didn't turn up at the appointed place at the appointed time, either their families would be shipped to the concentration camp, because they were mostly, the people left were mostly with mixed marriages, or they would take people from the Jewish Community Council, high officials from the Jew. So, of course, some of those people cut and ran, quite right, don't blame them a bit. So they took 20 hostages, and my father was one of those 20. And we know now that 8 of them they shot, not my father, and the rest were shipped to Auschwitz and gassed straight away.
And was your father one?
So my father was one of those, yes.
And he was killed in Auschwitz?
He was killed in Auschwitz. There's a death certificate which is meaningless, saying he died of heart problems, but my grandmother, there's a letter from my grandmother saying it's nonsense. Everybody died of heart failure, you know, just what they put. And not on that date either. So after the war, when the war ended, I was still in school, and the people who got in touch were my uncle and aunt from France, because they knew where I was. And they got in touch, and they even came across to check how I was.
And did you recognize them when they came?
You know what, I don't think I'd ever seen them. Actually, come to think of it, because they fled Germany in 33. I don't suppose they were foolish enough to go back. So, you know, I was a baby when he left.
How was the reaction when you met the blood relatives?
I can't remember. But as soon as travel was possible after the war, the Foners, which was a couple of years, I mean, you just couldn't go on a train after the war. There weren't any. When I was perhaps 16, something like that, the Foners arranged to take me to Paris to meet my uncle and aunt, and my grandmother would come to meet me.
Was she living in Paris?
No, she was living in Berlin.
She went back to Berlin?
She went back to Berlin, yeah. She had nowhere else to go.
Did she stay in the same house that they once...
Yes, the house was very badly damaged, but it was my Uncle Ludwig's, his dream in life was to re-establish the family printing business. It was a big printing company, more than 100 people.
In Berlin? In Berlin.
Druckerei Max Lischwitz. And also to rebuild the house, of which I was part heir to. So he did. I mean, if you go, you can go to Berlin and you can see the house. It looks very nice. I mean, the building is not a house. There's about 40 flats in it, and shops at the bottom.
Who owns it now?
I don't know who. Actually, we went to put Stolpersteine, you know, those stumbling stones there. So we met the new owner, who's also a Jew, and it's also the Jewish newspaper has its offices there.
Really?
I don't. My uncle bought my share out before we got married, which sort of enabled us to start.
And Henry, when you went back to the house, did you have any recollections, or? You were very young?
I didn't go into it. Judy went into it. She went to Germany with her choir for something else, and they went to look at it.
You haven't been to look at it?
No, I haven't been into it. I don't even know which flat was ours.
And
what floor.
did you have any desire, or do you still have a desire to see
No.
where you grew up? Or
Well, I've seen where I grew up, but I've no desire to do it. I've been to Berlin. For many, many years I wouldn't go. But after we got married here, we were married here and we went to live in England, we went via Paris, and my Uncle Lulu came from Germany to see us, to meet us in Paris. I hadn't seen him since I was 6, and this was when I was, 26. So that was an emotional thing, but of course I couldn't talk to him. I couldn't talk to either of my uncles. Both my aunts spoke English, but neither of my uncles spoke English, and I didn't speak any German.
and
My
Henry,
French isn't good enough to talk.
when you met your grandmother, how was the interaction? Do you recall when you?
I think it was good, but I can't remember any details of it, really.
And
I was 16 or something like
And
that.
did your grandmother want you to come back to Germany to be with her, or you just felt your place was in England?
You see, I never knew why I didn't go back. Because after the war, I just stayed on in Swansea. Went to grammar school, went into the army. I volunteered to go into the army, by the way. At that time, I was already in Habonim, which was a Zionist youth movement. And at the time, if you left the country before you got your call-up papers, that was perfectly legal thing to do. And I was on a hachshara, ready to go on a kibbutz. And I decided not to leave the country with the other members of my Garin, because I thought then, I think now, that if the country saved my life, and the civic obligation was to join the army, then I should not try to get out of that. So I joined the British Army. I mean, it was conscripted, put it that way, but I could actually have claimed German citizenship as well. They gave me the extra choice, but I decided not to do that.
And what year was it when you joined the army?
Joined the army in 53, early 53. Served in Egypt and in the Sudan. Was in many ways fashioned my future.
And did you keep a connection with your grandmother and with your aunts and uncle?
Did I what?
Did you keep a close connection with your grandmother?
Yes, I kept in touch. My grandmother died in 1951. What happened was, when we got married in 1960, and we met my uncle in Paris, he invited us to come to Germany, and I said, no, thank you very much, I don't want to go to Germany. And as usual, Judy had a different view on things, a more holistic view. She said, listen, he's your uncle, and you shouldn't just judge. So we went to visit him in Germany, him and my aunt. It was a very interesting visit. This was 1960. I found that I just couldn't look at people in the street. There were these big fat Germans eating Schlagsahne with their big rolls of fat here. We enjoyed meeting my uncle and aunt, but we spent most of the time in Berlin in the zoo.
In the zoo?
Yeah, because I used to go there when I was a kid, I remembered that. And I didn't think that animals were Nazis, so I spent a lot of time. We spent most of our time in the zoo, but that was the last time. My grandmother was dead already, but that's the last time I saw my uncle, because shortly afterwards he had a heart attack and dropped dead.
And was your grandmother buried in Berlin?
Yes.
She's buried in Berlin.
She's buried in Berlin. And we kept in touch with my aunt, and the non-Jewish one, Valley. She was a very nice woman.
It's amazing what she did. She kept loyal to her husband.
Yep.
And a very.
She wasn't the only one. There were a lot of. There were demonstrations of non-Jewish wives in Berlin against the Nazis when they took their husbands. Yeah, she was a very nice woman, in spite of her family. The only thing I've got against her is when she died, all the money went to the Nazis. If it had gone to the dog's home, I'd have been much happier. If it had gone to me, I would have been even more happy, but when she died, all the money, all the family money went to the Nazis.
And Henry, what happened to the family, the Foner family that you were with?
To what?
The Foner family.
The Foner family?
Yeah.
Well, I kept on being a phoner. And it's only recently that I rediscovered some letters I'd forgotten about, where it's obvious there'd been some sort of negotiation between the Foners and the Lichtwitzes about me. Because I never thought about why I stayed in Swansea rather than being shipped back to Berlin, which is an obvious question, but I was probably 60-something before I thought about it. It just seemed natural. But there had obviously been some sort of negotiation, and it had obviously been decided to leave me there.
They thought it would be best for you, most probably.
Pardon?
Most probably the family put your interests first and realized that this would be a better life for you.
I think that was the reason. The Foners wanted me, and the Lichtwitzes decided it would be better for me. But I don't know the details. I only discovered this quite recently. So I stayed there, and I, went to school and studied a bit, and went off to the army and came back there, and then I decided to study chemistry. So I'd made enough money saved enough money in the army and from working afterwards to pay my fees for the first year. And then I got a scholarship, so I finished studying in Leeds, in northern England. And I ended up in Leeds mainly because I'd met nice Jewish people from Leeds when I was in the army in Egypt. So if I hadn't gone to the army, I wouldn't have met those people, and if I hadn't been to Leeds, I wouldn't have come to Israel, and I wouldn't have met my wife. And so it's a whole series of coincidences.
And when did the Foners, when did they pass away?
Oh, Uncle passed away probably in, let me think, 1965, something like that. And Auntie Winnie passed away. We came in Aliyah in 68, so 1969, 1970.
But did you ever regard them as your parents, or
did I ever what?
Did you feel they were like your parents?
Yes, I did. Yes, more so than my real parents, in fact. I mean, the funny thing is I never inherited anything from either lot, but that's just chance. But no, I consider them as my parents, as in fact, practically speaking, they brought me up. Yeah. So, sometimes when I do things, sometimes I think about it, I think they call it nowadays a meme. I think, oh, that's what Uncle Morris used to do. I never think, oh, that's what my father used to do, because I can't remember.
But I must mention, what your father did was very unselfish. For him he didn't know what was going to happen to you, and to send you away, it was a very unselfish thing of him.
Yes, it's an interesting...
And it must have been a very difficult decision, and incredibly, the hardest decision to make for a parent.
Yeah, there's documentary films about this. You see at the last minute they get the child and pull her out of the window.
There have
on
been
the train.
cases. There were cases.
Yes, it is. And you know, the interesting thing is, I never realized this so much until we have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. We have a boy called David who lives in Tel Aviv, and he has a son called Asaf, who's now 19. But when Asafi was born, our son came to us. He came to me, and he said, "You know, Abba," he said, "I never realized how unselfish and brave your father was when he allowed his son to go away on that train."
His only child.
Yes. My son said that to me. And I think that was the first time I really thought about my own father and how he must have felt. That's what brought it home to me when my own son said that to me. Not strange thing to happen, yeah.
Henry, this is unbelievable. Can I ask, Henry, what message would you give to the next generation and to people who are watching this, or from your life experience and from what you've gone through?
Well, that's a difficult question.
I know,
I became a Zionist, I suppose, partially because of what happened to me. And I remained a Zionist. And I'm still convinced that although Israel is the most dangerous place in the world for a Jew, I still remain convinced that Israel is of prime importance for Jews. And I think that we should try to make this all the goyim, as they say.
a light to the nations.
Yeah, to make this a place which people would want to live in, because I think it's really important. And I think it's more important, perhaps, for people like us who are not religious, but who have a sort of Orthodox background, than for people who are really religious. Because I think it's impossible to live in the diaspora and not be religious and bring up your children as Jews. And this is one of the reasons why Judy and I came here, because here it is possible to do that, because the whole country is Jewish. The festivals are Jewish, the calendar is Jewish.
You feel.
You feel at home, and I think it is important that Jews should have a place where they can go. And I suppose if I have a message to the younger generation, which sounds a bit pompous, is that you should make this a place where people behave in the best of the Jewish tradition, which isn't the ultra-Orthodox, in my opinion, which we see here, because here everything is black and white.
But it is changing. You are finding,
I don't know.
there's more compromise and things. I think it's changing.
We have very good friends who are very, very, very religious. And they, from England, and they will invite us to lunch on Shabbat. And they'll say, park your car in the drive. because they know we're not going to come by walk to wherever they live in Jerusalem. And it's more important for them to see their friends than what their friends' private relationship with God it happens to be. And that is a very, that rings a bell with the way I was brought up.
We were also brought up like that, sure.
Yes, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Whereas there are very few well, I don't know if they're quite ultra-Orthodox, but very Orthodox people who would do that in Israel. They would look askance at it. And I think that sort of a live and let live attitude, it's just a pity there's not more of it here.
Please God, we can.
Yeah, please God. I think it's getting worse. I'm not sure it's getting better.
I feel it's getting better.
You do?
I really do.
Okay.
Henry, I really do. I have many patients from all spectrums, and you see there's a lot of it is getting better. I think the divide, please God, is getting better. Henry, I really want to thank you. If I could just absolutely cover it. If I could just come in.
This is a selfie.
I just want to thank you, Henry. I must tell you, it's been such an amazing experience. It's been such a privilege and honor to be with you and to hear. You are such an inspiration, Henry. You are so you're so positive, really, and what you've gone through, and you don't have any. You just have such positivity when you speak. How you've conducted your life. You don't have hatred, and there's a lot to be bitter about. And you look at the positive, and you are really an inspiration, Henry. You're an inspiration for all of us. We can all strive to emulate. Really, you are somebody that is exceptionally special, and I feel very honored and privileged to have met you and to have heard you and to have documented your story, and I really do appreciate it sincerely.
Well, first, thank you very much. And let me say just one thing. The person I am today is because of the woman I married 60 years ago.
It's wonderful.
So if there's any credit, I think most of it goes to her.
And I think it's also your parents and the Foners that took you in as well.
Got it.
Thank you so much.